South Africa fears that its progress in curbing inflation could be reversed by escalating global trade tensions and the potential for a VAT increase. The nation's budget presentation was recently delayed due to a disagreement over a proposed VAT hike, which has now been dropped from the revised budget expected on March 12. These concerns are amplified by the ongoing global trade tensions stemming from Trump tariffs. And joining me from around this, I have Professor Andre Roux, Economics, University of Stellenbosch. I think that is Professor of Economics at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
All right, let's begin with some insight into how global trade tensions characterized by uncertain trade conditions and retaliatory tariffs feed into South Africa's economy and the implications.
Yes, well, as you are quite rightly pointing out, as we often say, but it seems to be even more so now, the world has become a very volatile place. And certainly since the beginning of the year, conditions seem to have changed, unfortunately, not for the better. So we've obviously got the sword hanging over everybody of possible tariffs imposed by Donald Trump. Now, if he were to impose tariffs, let's say 10% across the board for all countries, without any retaliation, even that would lead to probably higher global inflation, probably higher interest rates or interest rates not dropping. We add to that, as you pointed out, the risk aversion, the turbulence, the uncertainty, and we'll probably find from a local perspective our currency weakening, much more than one would have thought. If we were to weaken, according to the Reserve Bank, to 21 rand to the dollar, then that would mean our own domestic inflation rate, which is currently right down at towards the bottom of the target rate, almost barely 3%, would perhaps rise to as much as 5%. And that would mean, obviously, that interest rates here might not increase, but they will not fall as rapidly or as regularly as might have been the case before all of this. So I think what we're looking at is, if I were the governor of the Reserve Bank in the next Monetary Policy Committee meeting, I would play it safe as a committee and decide not to lower interest rates at that meeting and rather see what happens after that. We know that in the last meeting of the 6 members, 2 actually voted against any further decrease. So I think it's actually putting interest rate drops on hold for the time being.
Oh, that's quite interesting. Talking about inflation and, of course, what you think the SARB should do during its next meeting. And you're saying, are you preferring a hold? That's what you're saying, right?
Sorry, I missed that. I
said you prefer a hold, right? You're saying the SARB should not cut rates at this point in time.
Yeah, I think given the volatility and the uncertainty, I would rather err on the side of being conservative. Naturally, there are strong arguments for lower interest rates, as we all know. Growth is very low, unemployment very high. But given the fact that in the last 3 or 4 years, they worked so hard to bring inflation down, it would be a disappointment to now undo all that hard work with an untimely decision. So yes, I would keep interest rates on hold for the time being. And as I say, that's a result of all this global uncertainty, possible tariffs. We don't know whether South Africa will be a particular victim of tariffs or other kinds of punishments.
Absolutely, we don't know. But of course, what would be the signal for maybe the interest rates to then start coming down for you? What should be the signal we should be looking out for?
Well, as I say, the good news is that inflation is behaving itself. It's come down to, as you know, the target range is 3 to 6%.
3%, yes.
The governor's got a very clear, he said so many times, he's aiming for the mid-range, so 4.5%. So anything less than that is conducive for lower interest rates in normal circumstances. We are lower than 4.5%, but as I said, with the uncertainty regarding tariffs and remember, it's Africa and South Africa might be caught in the crossfire of a global trade war. And with that kind of uncertainty, inflation might actually increase here to maybe 4.5 or 5%, and that would make the Reserve Bank reluctant to lower until such time that the certainty or uncertainty about tariffs has been resolved. Now, that could take a few weeks, could take a few months, who knows? As we know, as I was saying a bit earlier, over and above the general sort of warning that Trump has about imposing tariffs on anybody and everybody, he seems to be have a particular focus on South Africa. I'm sure you've come across all the media coverage and threatened to withdraw aid and investment and you name it. You mentioned briefly our budget speech, or non-budget speech last week. where it was a 2 percentage point, the VAT rate was going to be proposed. And that alone, by the way, would also have caused a bit more inflation. So I think in these, and the budget was now being postponed to 12th of March. So again, I would argue, in these extremely uncertain times of volatility, given the function of the Reserve Bank to maintain financial stability, I think it would be incumbent upon them to put any drop for the time being on hold.
Right, so we'll probably have to wait for some more time. That's what I hear from what you're saying. Now, speak to us about the direct spot between, U.S. and South Africa, considering the country's decision to stay away from G20 summit. Is South Africa worried about this? And what likely implications, what are the likely implications of a strained relationship between these countries?
Yeah, well, I can only talk about it from almost an economic point, not the politics happening in the background, but I would be worried. I mean, America is not our biggest export partner, but certainly one of our biggest. We export roughly goods to the value of 155 billion rand to China, to America, and we import around about 7.1% of our imports come from America. So they're not the biggest. China's the biggest, but they're certainly up there amongst the top 3 or 4. So we're talking about a lot of business. And if you think about the kind of things that we export, predominantly from our natural resource environment, America is a big importer of that. So it would be particularly harmful, any kind of barriers to our trade, particularly harmful to our farmers and to our miners. So that alone makes it problematic. In terms of aid, and we're not quite sure what he means by this, but cutting off aid to Africa and South Africa, aid which is so desperately needed, at least in the field of medical care, AIDS-related treatment, etc. That would be very harmful. And then we don't know what effect that might have on foreign investors. They might start getting nervous. They might become more risk-averse. So it's not something that should be downplayed. I think, unfortunately, and I don't want to make it personal, but I think, unfortunately, Mr. Trump and his team are being overwhelmed by what we might call fake news or half-truths, things taken out of context. There's some kind of agenda there, I don't know what. But really, I think it really is a concern that he's taken on the stance. I mean, the fact that he's kind of ignored the G20 meeting, that's a very powerful message and not a very good one for us. So really, I think we need to, and by that I mean our politicians, our diplomats, need to, behind the scenes, engage in their political and diplomatic talks to try to convince them at the very minimum of what the truth is regarding the accusations that certain people in this country are being persecuted. I mean, he's used that word. The word is used that white people are being persecuted. Now, I'm a white person. I know of nobody who's been persecuted. That's a strong word. And how you prove that, I really don't know. So I think it's about, we need a charm offense without bending over backwards. We don't want to look weak and lily-livered, but really just trying to put across the truth of the story.
Absolutely. Now, we have seen many African nations turn to taxes to sort of shore up revenue. I mean, beg your pardon, I'm moving away from just South Africa now. And this has met with strong resistance in some countries and even in Nigeria. I mean, our proposed tax reform bills, they are currently undergoing scrutiny at the National Assembly. However, with uncertainty around foreign aid, which you have also alluded to, and the expected gap that this could create, what are the options available to African economies?
Yeah, well, obviously I can only speak with any kind of conviction about South Africa. And the whole question of aid has always been and will always be a little bit contentious. One could argue that aid comes at a price. And the price is it makes us over-dependent. One could argue that over-relying on aid is almost like a drug addiction. And sometimes aid does more harm than good through unintended consequences. Having said that, obviously, and I'm talking about aid, not investment, obviously, especially in the field of health, I would argue, things such as medicine, medication for HIV and AIDS, we need that desperately. And hopefully it will not be entirely cut off. Because if it were to be cut off, then we conceivably see hundreds of thousands of people contracting HIV or have contracted HIV, might contract fully blown AIDS, and might sadly pass away prematurely. Having said that, it will be very interesting to see that if that aid were to be cut off, or large portions, to what extent other countries would step in, other countries such as China. Would they fill the gap? One wonders. Will the European Union fill the gap? Will India fill the gap? That we don't know. But that might be a possibility, an opportunity for that to happen. But to quickly answer your question, to summarize, aid is, in essence, can be damaging. It becomes seen as a kind of a crutch. But when it comes to aid regarding medical care and health care, I think Africa needs that desperately. We know that Africa is home to more than a third of the incidence of the burden of disease, the international burden of disease, although we only have 17% of the world's population, and only about 3% of total spending on health on this planet is spent in Africa. So obviously there are huge gaps there, and we need the aid for that.
Right, but then one thing that has come to the fore recently is domestic resource mobilization. Let me get your thoughts on that. How well can Africa pull this?
So again, the line isn't very clear. Can you just repeat that, please? Domestic
resource mobilization. That is one concept that has come to the fore since this whole conversation started. I want to get your thoughts on it and how Africa can run with it.
Our own, mobilize our own domestic resources. Is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Yes. Well, I mean, obviously, Economics 101 tells us that if you want more investment, by that I mean new infrastructure, new machinery, new equipment, you need savings. You need a pool of savings to finance that investment. And by the way, we assume we want more investment to create more economic growth in the future. So we often say investment is one of the engines of growth. For that, we need to mobilize resources to allocate to the investment effort. Now, of course, the reality is, in many countries, including many in Africa, resources are always constrained, especially when we talk about government resources. A government's resources, tax revenue, is constrained by the size of the tax base. So invariably, governments either have to, well, there are a few options. Either they have to allocate a big part of their limited tax base to finance current spending, such as salaries and wages of civil servants, and doesn't leave much behind for investment spending. Alternatively, they have to cut back on government spending on salaries and wages, which is not a politically strong possibility, or they have to borrow more money on the markets to finance much needed investment. That brings with it its own constraints, of course. As a government, when a government becomes overburdened in terms of debt, it creates problems into the future. So finding that fine balance is always going to be problematic. So the bottom line is, if we are not saving enough ourselves, we need to be able to attract foreign savings.
All right.
In other words, foreign investment. But that requires a nice kind of climate. I'm not talking about weather, but a good investment climate. It requires certainty, requires predictability. It requires
all right, Professor.
Potential of economic growth.
All right, thank you, Professor. I'm afraid we have to go now. Thank you so much, Professor Andrea Rue, Professor of Economics, University of Stellenbosch Business School. Thank you so much for your thoughts and time on the show today.
Yeah.